listening to Engineers Podcast. Engineers is a Silicon Valley community of startup builders where founders and operators share their first-hand knowledge on how to build and scale startups. I'm Oleg Kozhikov Sr., standing in for your regular host. Our guest today is Bill Macaitis. Bill has built marketing teams at 4 very successful companies and has achieved 5 exits over his career. He was a CRO and CMO at Slack, CMO at Zendesk, and SVP Marketing at Salesforce. These days, Bill enjoys helping and advising other companies on how to achieve hypergrowth. I'm really excited to bring Bill on to talk about his experiences of creating marketing powerhouses for the 3 fastest growing SaaS companies in history. Now, Bill, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Oleg. Excited to be here.
Same here. So maybe let's start talking about your background. If you could tell us and maybe how you gradually or maybe suddenly became a marketing expert in SaaS industry.
Well, thank you. I consider myself an above average marketer, so I always appreciate when people think a little higher than that. But, I've always loved marketing. I was the nerd in 6th grade reading the Wall Street Journal in the back of the room. I don't know. I just always have had a passion for business, always had a passion for marketing. I did my first startup right out of college. So we co-founded a site, early SaaS subscription model, grew to about 10 million members and sold it. And so I don't know, it's just been in my blood. Like I've always had, an incredible passion for this.
Great. Well, maybe let's start talking about how companies can achieve hypergrowth by developing cutting-edge marketing strategies. And the first question that I have is, what are some common characteristics or tactics that companies use to achieve this hypergrowth through marketing?
Yeah, great question. To me, and this is going to be a little different answer than maybe you're expecting, but I think the common characteristic that I see are companies that bring in people that are hungry to learn and are always on top of the newest trends. Because here's the thing, like how we got Salesforce to grow fast was different than how we got Zendesk to grow fast, which is different than how we got Slack to grow fast. And there's always new strategies, techniques out there. Right now, I'm a huge fan of product-led growth, and everything goes into that, virality loops. I've always been a strong inbound marketer, lots of content marketing, SEO. But the tactics and the strategies always change, right? And now there's incredible ad targeting technologies via API. There's amazing things you can do with the tech stack, from a nurturing, from a multi-touch attribution standpoint. So I think just like staying hungry, staying on top of the trends, and goodness, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably like that, right? You're probably someone that wants to stay on top of it. So I think that's a great characteristic and trend to help you out.
All right, great. And maybe can you be more specific and share maybe some example from your personal experience how marketing strategy was used by a company, to successfully break into a new market or industry?
Yeah, sure. So I think, my background's a little different in that I spent about half my career on B2C and half on B2B, right? And on the B2B side, it was B2B software. And so I'll say, a couple of things is that a lot of the tactics that worked on B2C, I found worked really well on B2B. And by the way, some of these don't require a huge budget, right? So one thing you'll find if you're in the B2B space is companies, for whatever reason, tend not to really invest in building a brand. And by building a brand, that doesn't mean like, spending, tens of $millions on big ad campaigns. That could just be something as simple as, create a unique visual identity, like choose a color palette, right? And be strong with it. At Zendesk, we had green, right? And that was our color palette, and there was green on everything. And we loved it, right? At Slack, we created a unique editorial tone and voice. So when you did the sign up, it wasn't just boring, like enter name, next, accept, cancel, right? We had a little fun with it. It was witty. It was fun. When you're using the software, you hopefully had an enjoyable experience. And some of that was just, rewriting the normal dialogues, right? When you go through the sign up and the adoption process, or choose a mascot, right? It's a great way to soften a brand. Especially in B2B, you tend to be in like these really crowded spaces, right? Like If you're in the data warehouse space, there's a dozen other companies that do that. If you're in the analytics space, there's a dozen companies. If you're in team messaging, there's a dozen companies, right? So you really have to stand out. I found building a brand that's a little different, that's more customer centric, that, people remember and smile when they interact with you, is a great, really way to differentiate yourself. And that's going to help you grow because, one of the most powerful ways to grow is word of mouth. Anybody that's in B2B or that looks at lead scoring knows that the best converting leads are someone that came from word of mouth, right? They came from a referral. Someone said, "Oh, I love you guys. You got to check them out." And those leads always convert great. So to get that word of mouth, though, you have to deliver, really positive experiences. And again, creating a brand that's kind of fun, that people have a good time interacting with, they're much more likely to recommend you. And then therefore, they're much more likely for your company to grow.
And of course, we understand the importance of growth, but how do companies balance the need for this short-term growth with the importance of building a sustainable long-term marketing strategy?
Yeah, that's the $10,000 question, right? And it's a really good question. And it's a really hard because a lot of the tactics I advocate for long-term growth, product-led growth, SEO, virality loops, customer centricity, those are all long-term plays, right? And if you kind of take those on, you're not going to see the results next week or next month. And that's the rub, right? It's sometimes these longer term strategies do take some time to build. I mean, a lot of times in product-led growth, they talk about a flywheel, right? And imagine this big stone wheel that's just hard to get moving, but once it starts to get moving, it's going fast, right? And it's really hard to stop. Those are really long-term strategies. I think there is definitely a need for sometimes for short-term growth and just to hit your short-term, metric, whether that's ARR or pipeline or MQLs, whatever you're going after. To me, that's where I supplement it with more paid vehicles. Like I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of really cool things that are happening right now in ABM with marketing and sales combining to go after a top 50 list. That works great, but it's a little more expensive, right? Would I want 100% of our business coming from that strategy? No. When you look at the unit economics, whether it's, CAC payback, your SaaS magic number, it's hard to maintain those paid campaigns. You're also not going to get as strong of a multiple, on your revenue when you look at your valuations. So I always try to think about not just how you can grow and grow fast, but how you can do it in a really scalable, capital efficient manner. And I think with, the economic climate that we're in, founders, marketers, you really need to focus on that. It can't just be, hey, I can get you 1,000 MQLs this month, but how much do those cost, right? And how can we build a foundation so that we can do this in the long run efficiently?
Yeah, maybe let's double click on measuring the success of the marketing strategy. Is there some critical, maybe most important metric that you would look at, or it's rather kind of a portfolio or a range of different metrics?
Yeah, great question. I like the portfolio approach. So historically, what I see in my space, which is B2B SaaS, B2B software, is historically most marketing teams only cared about leads or MQLs. And I get why that has happened, but I do think that creates some kind of unnatural incentives, right? If all you care about is leads, you tend to see marketing teams gate everything. So all their content's gated. They just care about you filling out a form and that's it, right? But if you kind of look at where your revenue comes from, so all the companies I worked at, Slack, Zendesk, Salesforce, a lot of the other companies I advise now, historically, usually about 50% of the revenue comes from add-on upgrade expansion, right? So there's a whole host of not just bringing in new business, but you have to think about how do we expand and grow our existing business. So you have I call them these funnel metrics, MQLs, ARR, add an upgrade, ARR. Then also, I think if you're a good marketer, you're going to think about your brand. I mentioned it, at the beginning of the pod. And the good news is, hey, there's lots of good brand metrics out there, right? It doesn't have to be all super fuzzy, we're going to build brand and we can't measure it, but we're going to do it. There's great metrics, whether that's aided recall, unaided recall, sentiment, share voice, share conversation. And not only that, it's a lot easier to get these metrics now. It doesn't cost a huge amount. You can get these, fairly cheaply now. So I think those brand metrics are great. I come from the customer centric camp, so I like experience based metrics, right? And those are things like net promoter score, customer satisfaction, daily active users, even things like PQLs, product qualified leads. I think marketing definitely has an ability to influence and shape those, and so. It's kind of like what I mentioned earlier. Like, I really think that even metrics, like, you really have to stay on top of these. Like, there's, I think 5 years ago, we weren't looking at things like product qualified leads or daily active users or net promoter score, right? It was, again, mostly just leads. So I think to be a good marketer, you really have to think about, what metrics are going to encourage long-term scalable growth, right? And to do that, I think you do have to balance those pipeline metrics, the brand metrics, and those experience metrics.
And how do companies navigate the challenges and risks that are associated with rapid growth in their marketing efforts?
Yeah, it's hard, right? When you're growing that fast, I think there's kind of a, growth at all costs mindset that comes. And a lot of times marketing, when a company is growing well, you get a lot of that money that comes in, right? You'll do a new round, and a good chunk of that money goes to the go-to-market teams and the marketing. And I think, again, you have to kind of have this, in my eyes, like a long-term mindset towards capital efficiency, right? It can't just be growth at all costs. Like, you really have to think about, like, do the diligence, know your lifetime value, know your CAC payback, know how much it's costing you in these different channels. Invest in multi-touch attribution. That's a really important one, because what I found across B2B, and I think it applies to B2C too, is people don't see one ad and buy you. they see 3 or 4 ads, they read a piece of content, maybe they heard, got a referral from a friend, they go to a website, maybe it's another couple months as a lead, then they finally buy you, maybe they see an event. There's a whole bunch of touch points that happen, and having a really solid understanding of multi-touch attribution modeling, which basically just says, like, hey, of all these touches, what do we give credit to? Do we give it to, equal for all those touch points, or first or last, or regression analysis, whatever it is, right? It's good to have a really solid understanding of those, so that you can really in the long run know, like, what channels are going to be most efficient. So like I said, even if you're growing fast, like, it's a great situation to be in. I think for a lot of companies now, probably the opposite's happening, right? They're going through, a lot of global headwinds on the economic front. And so I think there's even more pressure for marketing to kind of prove, like, hey, like, we generate business, or we're helping out, right? And if you have the right metrics that you're tracking, if you can prove it pretty solidly, you're in a much better position, the next time you have to present to the board or your CFO.
And can we start talking about maybe your experience with implementing a modern marketing tech stack?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of the marketing tech stack. I think that, again, like, there's a lot of ways you can grow, and some companies will do is they'll throw people at problems, right? So whatever the problem is, we'll just hire more people. I think when you're growing super fast, you really do have to think about how you can do it in an efficient way. And a lot of times tech is going to help you there, right? So, the marketing tech stack is massive now, depending on what tools you're going to use. I mentioned multi-touch attribution modeling. I think that's huge. I think predictive lead scoring, right, is really big. Lead scoring shouldn't just be, how many times they came to your website or what pages did they view. You should look at, firmographic data, demographic data. You should look at all the previous companies of that size and shape, how well they converted. You should be layering in product usage data, a PQL type data into lead scoring. That's important. Obviously, the analytics are important. Heat map. Content marketing, nurturing. There's so many great tools out there. Even all the ad targeting side. I would just say, again, like, just try to stay on top of it. I think historically a lot of people relied on the analysts for this, and now you're starting to see a lot more user reviews are becoming more common. So just like in B2C, B2B has user reviews, right? And whether that's like a Trust Radius or a G2 Crowd, there's a lot of good sources out there for information for building up that marketing tech stack.
Mm-hmm. And have you gone through selecting and integrating any new technologies into your marketing stack? It sounds like you did, but maybe if you could double click on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's always new ones that are coming out, right? And like I said, I think I've leveraged a lot of ABM strategies as well. And I think everything from like, hey, let's come up with a top 100 list for targeted accounts. And then when any of those individual accounts land on our homepage, maybe we dynamically change it. And that homepage literally gives a specific message for that company, right? So I think like I said, there's always new technologies coming out. You just want to make sure you're staying on top of this. And is it going to allow you to deliver a better experience? Is it going to allow you to generate more ARR, more pipeline. And again, not just for net new customers, but I do think like, hey, what does your marketing tech stack look like to help grow your existing customers, right? And that might be something like, in product education or messaging. I think that's really important. So if you're in the software space, do you have a module inside your software that allows you to speak and talk to your existing customers? I think that's a huge element. And for these tech stacks, you always have to think about how you're going to build in those new tools and what role they're going to have.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious to maybe to get some detail on that. So how often is the stack? I mean, how is it? What's the pace of kind of how fast it is evolving? Is it, you don't upgrade it every month, right? So no. There's some add-ons maybe that happen at some frequency. So how often does this happen? Is this a superficial or not superficial, but maybe a lighter add-ons or versus maybe some fundamental changes? What's the frequency of change here?
So you're going to have certain elements of your core tech stack, right? They're going to be like your CRM, your marketing automation, your analytics. It's not like you want to be changing those out every week. It takes a long time to put these in and install them and get people comfortable with them. So, but I will say that like SaaS has shifted from the on-prem days where you'd literally install these on servers and off of like, CD-ROMs and stuff, and they were completely hard to use. SaaS allows you to have a much more user-friendly software that you just log in. You don't need to install anything. You don't need to go through the IT team. So it does allow you to switch tools, more frequently, more easily. Now, I think like, for when I was CMO, I would always kind of empower my teams to go out and, find the tools that they were going to allow them to be successful. So the content marketing team had their own tech stack. My ad demand gen team had their own tech stack. PR team had their own tech stack. So I think there's going to be unique needs for each team. And of course, you have to be careful, right? Because, you can have proliferation of tools and you find out you're spending a lot and no one's really using them. So you got to be a little careful with that. But I think to me, an annual cadence is good to kind of think about, hey, for these major pieces, does it make sense to insert something new? And if so, what does that look like? Yeah. So one story we had was, like I said, we had mentioned earlier, but I love multi-touch attribution modeling. I geek out on that. I think it's super fascinating. And so, you kind of see this evolution of multi-touch, right? From going from a lot of lead scoring tools would just go, oh, we're going to give all the credit to the very first thing that they found out about us, or we're going to give all the credit to the very last thing they found out about us. And that tends to break down when you have 10, 15, 20 touches before someone buys with you, right? Giving all the credit to the first or last gives you a very distorted view of what works. So the evolution then went to any touch, we're going to give all touches equal. And then you started to even move to more AI regression analysis. So it would look at every single touch point and compare that to all the other businesses that closed and go, oh, which touch points tended to generate the biggest deal sizes or had the shortest deal cycles or had other favorable unit economics. And it would, using AI logic, it would assign its own value to that. So I love that as an AI fan, as a math nerd, right? Hey, that totally made sense to me. But what I found in a couple of companies I worked with, you would run into the C-suite and they would be it was very confusing for them. They're like, well, wait, in the old model, we gave 3 points if they landed on the pricing page or if they did this. And, it was more of a black box, right? And so I do think you have to be careful, marketing with the tech stack, really with anything in marketing. I think you do have to spend a lot of cycles on identifying your internal stakeholders. Hey, your head of sales, your head of product, your CFO, your CEO, the board members, and educating them like, well, hey, this is why we're using this tech stack. This is what it does. This is, why it's best to breed. Hey, here's the results we're getting from it. Because if you just kind of put your heads down, you don't really, build those relationships or kind of evangelize, you're in a dangerous position because people just don't know what's going on and they don't have buy-in. Usually within an organization, people tend to like marketing. There's a lot of marketing experts within an organization. And so you really got to make sure, they understand the decisions you're making with the tech stack, but even more broadly, like all of your marketing strategy.
And what would you recommend to a younger CMO or marketing professionals, how to stay up to date on the latest marketing technologies and trends, and then determining which one are worth it to invest in?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So I think this is literally one of the most important things you can do when you're out there and you're trying to improve your marketing acumen and just your overall knowledge of what's going on. So for me, I think I love podcasts, right? So I listen to about 100 different podcasts. There's probably a dozen or so that are marketing related, like including this one. I think that's a great way to stay on top of things. There's lots of great conferences out there, whether it's social media, web analytics, content marketing, go to those, go to the sessions, listen, learn, make new contacts. There's tons of great webinars. I'm a big YouTube fan. There's so much good content on YouTube, right? Some of the stuff, I think you just kind of have to have like a passion to learn, right? Like when I was in my 20s, I really got into SEO, but I'm older now. I'm in my late 40s. So that was a long time ago. But anyway, there wasn't a lot of content on SEO, and there certainly were no classes that I could go take on it. And so, but I just started going, there were a lot of SEO forums. And I went and I spent a couple hours every night, for a month. And I just read and learned about, black hat and domain authority and PageRank and, all these different concepts. And pretty soon, I was the expert on SEO, right? So I don't know. I think really just kind of comes from that, stay hungry, right? The best piece of career advice I ever got was, it was this last day lunch. And went out and I asked him, I'm like, hey, what piece of advice do you have? And he's like, Bill, it doesn't matter if you're employed or not. It matters if you're employable. And I think what he meant by that is hey, you got to have your skill sets, right? Even if you have a great job, a great role, but your skill sets are getting really dusty, that's going to be hard. But if you're on top of things, if you know the latest tech, the latest strategies, you're very employable, right? And so that was something that always stayed home with me.
Well, that's a good segue into talking about how to build a world-class marketing team, and maybe let's start with how can companies identify the key roles and skills that are needed for a successful marketing team?
Yeah, so I think first off, there's a dozen different marketing org structures out there. The ones that I've used are different than the ones of other CMOs I respect. And I don't think there's one size fits all. I'm a big sports fan. I kind of think your marketing team and really your marketing strategy should adapt to the team that you have. So if I have Shaquille O'Neal on my basketball team, you better bet I'm going to, pass the rock in the post a lot, right? Because he was really dominant, right? And if I have Steph Curry, I'm going to do a lot of 3-point shooting. So I do think you need to adapt to what you have. I remember at Zendesk we had a couple people that were just amazing at doing video. And a lot of our marketing strategy, we leveraged that, right? We did a lot of in-house video for our demos, for product launches, for a lot of our ad campaigns. And that's because we had a Shaquille O'Neal there, right? It was let's do that. So I think some of it, it's hey, look at your existing team, right? And figure out hey, where am I really strong, right? You may have someone that's great at podcast advertising and they know every single podcast. They know how to do the attribution for it. They know where to get good rates. They know how to make the right creative, when the ad comes on. And that's great. Go into that, right? Because there's 100 things you can do in marketing. There's no shortage of strategies and tactics you can do. But most marketing orgs, they, at least in my experience, they tend to peanut butter it. They tend to build a team for everything, and then they don't get quite as strong in certain areas. So that being my overarching advice. That being said, like when I've just from my own personal experience, when I build teams, usually I will start with the marketing ops and analytics team. I just think like having like setting up all your metrics, start tracking your brand metrics, start building the tech stack, like that's very foundational. You need to have that. Then I tend to build up my product marketing team, and PMMs are different for everyone. But for me, PMMs, they were in charge of the storytelling. They were in charge of, identifying our ICP personas. Sorry, I'm throwing out a lot of acronyms here, but they were that foundational element. And then I would start to build content marketing teams. I was a big fan of that, and the SEO that comes from it. Then you start getting into campaigns team that did more paid media. And again, eventually, as you grow bigger and bigger, you start even to see like things like, a PR team, a growth team, an events team, international. Again, these teams can get pretty large depending on, the life cycle and the company size that you're at. But ultimately, though, I think it's good to be flexible with like what those teams are and who are leading them.
And can you share some examples of companies that managed to build this strong in-house marketing teams outside of Slack, Zendesk, and Salesforce? That, the teams that were really impactful for business of these companies.
Yeah. So there's obviously a lot of companies that I respect out there and what they've been able to do. Like I'm a big fan of Calendly, right? So I like product-led growth. And to me, again, product-led growth doesn't mean the product team does it. It means that people just spend most of their time in the product. So how do you infuse your marketing into the product, your sales into the product? Your service and customer support into the product. And I think they do, a fantastic job there. I've always been a big fan of HubSpot, with the work they've done on the content marketing side, and the nurturing side, and there's tons of new companies that are coming out. That's the great thing. Like there's great SaaS companies all over the world. I'm really lucky. Like my current role, I serve as an advisor, a board advisor to a lot of these different companies. And there's fantastic ones out there, right? Like I'm working with a company, Superside. They do kind of design freelance for larger companies. And, it's been awesome to work with them. They have such great creative. They have such great energy. They do fantastic events. I think ChargeBee is fantastic. That's another company that I've worked with. There's a long list out there. And I think like now it's like really, it's a golden age of SaaS. There's so many fantastic companies that are building, incredible software for, people to use and address their pain points. So it's something I feel really lucky to work with so many great teams right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a lot of talk about and excitement around us, around potential of generative AI.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what's your thinking in terms of how this generative AI could improve and augment the role of a marketer in a company?
Yeah. So it's a great area. I mean, it's just what you're talking about earlier, right? Like a new trend comes out of nowhere, right? And it's like, hey, if you spend time in it, you know what it is, that what's possible. And, I've spent a good amount of time researching this. Like, it is amazing. I mean, obviously everything's going around ChatGPT now, but there's a lot of predictive AI that can help in numerous areas. So, like if you're an SEO manager, wow. Like, I mean, you can have, ChatGPT, do keyword research. You can have it write headlines, write blog posts. I see predictive AI being huge in the campaign demand gen area. So especially around the media optimization, there's so much of marketing that's not just like building the stuff, but also like knowing how to optimize it. And I think there's a huge opportunity there. I mean, obviously, you have to be careful because, for those that have used ChatGPT, the answers that come up with sound very confident and they sound right, but sometimes they're totally wrong, right? And so you got to be careful, like how much you're leveraging it. But I do think that's a trend that's going to be there. That's going to come. And like I mentioned earlier, like I like using AI and multi-touch attribution modeling because I myself cannot go through 60,000 leads and look at every single element and 100 different signals and see how they've converted and be able to attribute credit to it. And so I feel like it's definitely coming. And for no matter what your role is in marketing, it's good to do research on like, hey, how they think it's affecting or how you can leverage it, how you can be a better marketer, right? So it's an exciting time.
Okay, yes, it is. It is. I totally agree. I would assume that in your previous roles, you probably spent some time and effort to attract and retain top talent for your marketing teams. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Certainly, I think anytime that you're, building a team, you want to attract great talent. I think for me, it was always like how to create a special culture because every company has their own culture. And even within marketing, you're creating a culture. So, for me, like, again, like the big litmus test I used was like, hey, are people passionate? Do they like to learn? Do they like to, try new things? Are they open-minded? Are they customer-centric, right? That was a big lens for me. Like when I would do my interviews, it's like if someone never said the word customer once in the interview, I'm like, well, they're probably not very customer-centric, probably not a good fit for us. Yeah, a little bit of a red flag there. So I think it's important. I think at the same time too, like you do need to identify who are your top performers, right? How can you coach them up? How can you get them even more excited, right? How can you give them more? Right? Because sometimes like we talked about earlier, marketing org charts, sometimes org charts aren't always perfect. And I remember like I had a guy who led, our product marketing team, but also our international team, also our events team. And you might think like, oh, sometimes those don't go together, but like he was really passionate about it. And I was like, hey, great. Like, okay, you got it. Right. I'm a big fan of like whenever someone is passionate about it, like I'd rather have a leader who's passionate about what they're leading it up and maybe doesn't have the perfect background for it than someone that quote unquote has the credentials, but just isn't very passionate about that. I don't like that team's not going to be as thought provoking. And so, and I think, you got to be a good manager, good leader, especially with the top performers, right? You should be doing a weekly one-on-one. You should be giving them, feedback on a regular basis. You should be thinking about their comp, right? Like, what does it look like? Is it at market? Because it's not easy, right? I think a lot of times like marketing leaders, you think in an abstract world, it's like, oh, we're just sitting down doing tactical work all day. But really, it's like you spend a lot of your time on your org, on your people, coaching them, mentoring them, leading them. You spend a lot of time, working with those different stakeholders I mentioned earlier, educating, evangelizing. Like the role really shifts from being like an individual contributor to kind of a team leader and what's expected from it.
And how can companies ensure their marketing team is aligned with the overall business strategy?
Yeah, great question. So I thought of all the companies I worked at, Salesforce did the best job at this. And so they actually had a process. They used, it was called a V2 MOM. You can look it up, like V2 and then MOM. It was similar to OKRs for those that have used those. That's kind of the Google goal setting. But basically, the idea was like Mark would come out at the beginning of the year and he would say, hey, here are the top 10 things that we're going to do as a company. And not only that, he would stack rank those top 10. It wasn't like they were all equally weighted. It was literally like the number one most important thing to do as a company. And like, for instance, that might be, hey, we want to grow the Service Cloud to 40% market share. And I think like that, having that ability to clearly articulate the company goals was really important. And then like as a marketing leader, it allowed me then to go in and go, okay, here's the top 3 goals as a company, top 5 goals, top 10, whatever they are. Like, okay, what does my marketing team look like? Does my team reflect what those goals are? How can I make sure they're following those goals? Like, what are those metrics for those top 10 goals? And make sure my team's aligned to it. What I find is like advising a lot of different companies now is a lot of times the companies at the top skip that step, right? Like a lot of times I'll be like in a kickoff call and I'll be like, hey, everybody on the call, write down what the company's top 3 goals are, right? And you'll get 27 different answers, or a lot of them are like, I don't know, right? And so I think most important if you're the marketing leader, it's like, hey, look, push your CEO or whoever, the team, to go like, hey, what are our top goals for this year? Please stack rank them. Please tell me, give me a metric associated with that. And then as the marketing leader, you go, okay, now I'm going to build my marketing strategy to reflect how I'm going to hit those goals. Like for instance, like remember at Salesforce one year, Japan was really important for us. We wanted to improve our market share in Japan. And so like, hey, I shifted a lot of our internal energy to how do we support Japan more? What does that look like from a field marketing perspective? What does that look like from a content marketing perspective, from a campaigns perspective, right? We had to shift a lot of our energy there to reflect and make sure it was aligned to what the top overall company goals were.
Mm-hmm. Great. And can you discuss some common mistakes that SaaS companies make in their marketing efforts and how to avoid them?
They hire Bill Macaitis. I think one is like just not coming up with your metrics, right? I think unfortunately, sometimes, companies or CEOs will have a bad experience with marketing because they'll be like, hey, I feel like we spent all this money and we didn't get anything out of it, right? And so I do think it's really important for you to go, define those metrics, again, whether pipeline metrics, brand metrics, experience metrics, and then track your marketing efforts against those metrics, right? Because if you're just spending people time or dollars and you can't really show the impact, that's going to come back and bite you. I think hiring too fast can come and bite you. Hiring people that don't share the company's values can really come and bite you. I remember when we were at Slack, we had one or two hires that just, they knew the space incredibly well. They were perfect domain experts, but they didn't really fit our values. And I think at the time it was like, oh, well, we got to hire, we're growing so fast, we just need someone for this role. Great. They know their stuff really well. But that came back and bit us because they weren't a good value, a good culture fit. And that ended up causing a lot of internal chaos. And, it's just one of those things like, God, I wish I had not, we had not pulled the trigger on that one. And so, ultimately, I think, look, there's 1,000 ways you can fail in marketing. There's a lot of things can go wrong, but, my best practices would be, make sure you're very conscientious how you're building your team, make sure you build the right metrics, think about what a more modern marketing strategy looks like, stay on top of the trends and you can, minimize the mistakes. You're always going to make mistakes. That's fine. In fact, you should be, right? You should be trying new things and failing, but you want to have it in the right construct so that you can build that long-term scalable growth engine.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good. So maybe let's spend a minute or two talking about what you're up to these days. And I understand you work with the young companies. And so maybe if you could talk about how you help them to achieve hypergrowth.
Yeah, sure. So I had, like I said, I was really fortunate. I had about 5 exits in my career. And I had a point where, we had kind of had an awesome run with Slack and, they had gone IPO and I just was like, what do I do next? Do I go down the board route? Do I go down the advisor route? Do I go down the retirement route? And I'm way too young to retire and I'm terrible at golf. And so I said, I love working with other operators, right? And I had a couple, offers to become VCs, but I love working with great founders, right? And so I said, hey, I think that's where I can best give back. I can best make an impact. And so today I do that full time. I work with a select group of startups. They range in size. Usually it's like series A, B, or C from a startup perspective. And, and I try to help them out wherever I can. It tends to be a lot of it is on, hey, how do I build a more capital efficient growth model, right? Between marketing, sales, success support, what does that look like? A lot of it's on org design, helping mentor maybe an existing leader or maybe help them find a new leader. Some of it's building a tech stack that we had talked about. Just someone that's kind of been there, that's seen kind of growth and what it takes to win categories. And that can help them out. And so it's something I really enjoy. If your company listening to this and you're ever interested, just reach out to me on LinkedIn. Always happy to have that conversation. But yeah, it's something I find really rewarding. I love growing companies. I love helping them, dominate categories. It's just super fun. I've always loved business as long as I've been alive. So it's always fun to work with other great founders.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe let's start wrapping it up. And so maybe the last question that might be a little bit open-ended that I have to you is that looking back at your illustrious career, what would be the most important thing that you learned, in your opinion?
Most important. Well, I already gave my employable piece of advice. So I'll go with this. Like, I don't think there's a huge difference between B2C and B2B marketing.
Why is that?
I just think at the end of the day, people are people, right?
Yeah.
And, I'm a consumer and I buy a lot of stuff, and I'm a B2B executive and I've bought a lot of stuff. And at the end of the day, we're people, right? And we love brands, and the brands that we love, we tend to buy more of and recommend and spread. And a lot of tactics for B2C you can use for B2B. Some of the tactics you use for B2B, you can use for B2C. I just think take a holistic approach, be customer centric, right? That's my always approach. Like, look at it from the customer's point of view, not your point of view. Don't optimize around your own internal work structure and design and that. Optimize around the customer, delight them. And I think you can really win that way. So maybe I'll go with that one. Just because I think for a lot of people think like, oh, we're selling to enterprises in B2B. We can't make someone laugh in our ad, or it's got to be really boring and we have to use all acronyms, and we have to wear suits all the time, right? Like, what? But I found like people aren't like that. They're just regular people. And you can use a lot of the same stuff for B2C that people love there and take the best of it to the B2B.
All right, great. Before we go, what's the best way for our listeners to reach you?
Yeah, just reach me on LinkedIn. I'm usually checking that daily, so you can always send me a message there, and happy to connect. And I'm always happy to make new connections.
All right, we're going to end up with there. If you like the show, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating. Thanks, Bill, for joining the show today. Really appreciate your time and insights.
Thanks so much for having me. I had a great time.